that I was available. Good morning again.
Good morning.
We are in week 4. We're almost done with our sermon series called
What's worship got to do with it?
All right, y'all getting it. Y'all gonna really have it by next week. What's worship got to do with it? We are in week 4, and I've been having a lot of conversations with colleagues and friends and peers, and we all sort of ask those same questions. Why do we do this thing? Are we doing it right? Is there a right? Is it even necessary? In an age full of growing disinvestment, divestment from spiritual and religious institutions, growing nihilism, people rejecting moral and religious principles, what is this all about? There are many who find themselves unsure about faith, unsure about church, but we know that there is power in ritual. Whether it's in this building or outside, all of you did a ritual this morning. You probably woke up and you put your slippers on if you had them, and then you brushed your teeth, I hope, okay? And then you maybe had some coffee. You did a ritual. There's power in ritual. That's why people keep trying to figure this thing out. Reverend Talitha Arnold said, we engage in these acts because words have their limits. Rather than talking about something, we need to, as Nike says, just do it. These are the sacraments. Last week we were talking about baptism, and this week we're talking about communion. These are the rituals, and these rituals are a visible sign of invisible grace. We participate in the ritual, whatever it is, to be reminded of the intangible blessing we have sought and aim to give to others. This week, we are talking about communion, and this passage that we are in today might sound very familiar to you. You hear a lot of it every first and second Sunday here, known as the words of institution in communion. And you might know some of the other contextual elements surrounding it because you heard it during Holy Week. It is often recited during Holy Week, but very few sermons preached about it. And so today, I invite you to meet me in the 26th chapter of Matthew. 26th chapter of Matthew, verses 17 through 35. I am reading from the New Revised Standard Version. And it reads, on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying, where do you want us to make the preparations for you to eat the Passover? Jesus said, go into the city to a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, my time is near. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover meal. When it was evening, Jesus took his place with the 12 disciples, and while they were eating, he said, truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me. And they became greatly distressed and began to say to him one after another, surely not I, Lord. It ain't me, Jesus. He answered, the one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born. Ooh. Judas, who betrayed him, said, surely not I, Rabbi. He replied, you have said so. While they were eating, Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, gave it to his disciples, and said, take, eat, this is my body. Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will never drink again of this fruit of the vine until the day when I drink it new with you in my Creator's kingdom. When they had sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Then Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go ahead of you to Galilee." Peter said to him, "Even if I fall away because of you, I will never fall away." Jesus said to Peter, "Truly I tell you, this very night, before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said to him, "Even though I must die with you, I will not deny you." And so said all the disciples. The word of God for the people of God. I come to you today with the thought, breaking bread with betrayers. Breaking bread with betrayers. There is a plot against Jesus. There is a hit out on him, and he knows this, and he has known this, and he has been trying to prepare his disciples for a very long time. He and thousands of Jews have descended on the city of Jerusalem for the Passover. The Passover, it was the greatest annual festival, a sacred gathering time where people were remembering their ancestors' deliverance from the perils of Egypt. Even though their ancestors were delivered, they were not yet delivered from the stronghold of Rome. Their ancestors had been delivered from Egypt, but these people have continually over generations found themselves under the hand of empire after empire after empire. And even though they have found themselves in a new captivity, under a new violent regimen, they take time out of their schedules to remember their former deliverance. Many of them traveling miles on foot to gather to remember a God that is still God, even in the face of death-dealing ideologies and legislation and starvation. Even though everything wasn't as it should have been, the tax collectors were sucking people dry in this day and age, and some religious leaders cared more about respectability politics than freedom, and people preaching good news like John the Baptist were being executed by the state. They still gathered to remember the stories of God's rescue and redemption, hoping that God's redemptive power would come their way again. The song says, "Come by here, my Lord." They are hoping for a kumbaya experience. They are still gathering. And I know some of them had doubts. Why wouldn't they have doubts? They've been in and out of some version of captivity for generations. If it wasn't the Egyptians, it was the Assyrians. And if it wasn't the Assyrians, it was the Babylonians. And now it's the Romans. And yet they gathered to cultivate hope, perhaps, to find joy, perhaps. This is important because we are living in a world full of growing nihilism. Everything feels meaningless these days. Nothing matters, not religion, not being a part of a faith community, which is fine, not even political participation. They say that Generation Z is divesting from the political schemes of America. Everything seems to be meaningless these days. It seems as if all the systems surrounding us that we have been relying on are crumbling around us. Criminality is rising as gentrification squeezes life out of communities, and we just surpassed this week 200 homicides in DC. And if you don't think the two are connected, ask somebody. Infrastructure is weakening as water bursts through the walls of the subways in New York City. People are swimming in sewage and swimming in debt as student loan repayments re-enter our narrative. Y'all got to pray for me. I'm mad about it. Okay. It seems like racism, sexism, and homophobia dominate our cultural milieu, and we find ourselves fighting the same battles around equity and inclusion over and over again. Exhausting ourselves, exhausting our resources, limiting our capacity. Mostly, it feels like people are overwhelmed. I don't know if you feel it. Feels like everybody is exhausted, overwhelmed, having come through these last 3.5 years, and it seems like certain people haven't learned anything from them. We're overwhelmed by the state of our world. If it's not one thing, it's another. Forest fires and food deserts, hopelessness and helplessness, but the people still gathered. Just like we have gathered here today, and as they prepared for the festival, Jesus calls his disciples to a meal. Now, Jesus knows that his death is near, and he has been preparing his friends for their pending persecution. And I do not find it a coincidence that the Last Supper occurred during a festival where Jesus' folks were remembering their Exodus experience. It is not lost on me that while they were honoring the Passover, the commemoration of when they put the blood of the lamb on the door so that God would pass over them, it is not lost on me that Jesus is talking about sharing his blood for the forgiveness of sin. Jesus was preparing a meal, and he wanted to gather his close comrades in which he would offer his blood or a cup of wine as a new covenant. But there was something different about this. What he was offering would not become a force field against the vitriol and the hatred his comrades would face. Whereas in the Passover, the blood of the lamb protected them from the spirit of death. In this case, I don't think Jesus believed that would be the case. He knew that after he died, they would face even more persecution, even more death, and he wanted to prepare them for a new covenant, a new reality in which they would have to rely on community in order to survive. He gathered his disciples in preparation, and then he began rendering warnings of betrayal. This is so interesting because so many people talk about communion as the great feast of the saints. But in this pericope on which communion is based, it was no great feast. Jesus started reading some folks. He started reading them their rights. And he starts to call out some people who he feels will or have already betrayed him. This is also interesting because there's a lot of talk about Judas these days. I saw a quote online that said, it was by George Woodruff. It says, "The true test of Christianity is not loving Jesus, it's loving Judas." Yes, my. But what is interesting about this is that everybody thinks that the only betrayer in this passage is Judas. We get fixated on Judas, but there is a reason why this sacred meal is sandwiched between Jesus' insinuation that Judas would betray him and Jesus' suggestion that Peter would deny him. It's placed right in between those two moments. He calls out Judas on the front end and Peter on the back end. You see, because it's easy for us to identify the Judases in our lives. The ones who sit among us at the bottom of the list, the ones who betray us in the most egregious ways. The dean who sabotaged your tenure application at the university. The family member who stole money from you. The church member who intentionally stepped on your toes in the vestibule. It's easy to be like, oh, Judas. The people who commit these wildly egregious acts against us. But Jesus understood the human condition. He understood that even his best of friends, the ones who he called first, Peter, listen, Peter was the first person Jesus called. at the top of the list. Whenever you see a list of disciples, who's first? Simon, also known as Peter. That was Jesus's boy, Jesus's ace, okay? Even Peter would struggle. He understood the human condition. He understood that even Peter might crack under the weight of persecution, that in the midst of torment, the people might falter. He understood that in the face of economic uncertainty and threats against their family and struggles for quality food and dealing with landlords who put profits over people and dealing with unlivable wages, that the people would fall away. He understood that people might deviate from the mission of communal liberation. I don't know about you, but if I could be honest for a second, I know that I have faltered. From time to time, I know that even some of the people you think would never falter because we are all living under the weight of the empire, under the weight of growing demands and shrinking budgets, under the stress of having to continue to advocate for basic needs like fresh fruit in a grocery store. Under the pressure of trying to stand in the gaps the state social services have left wide open, Jesus understood. He understood that while many of us may never become somebody's Judas, most of us could easily slip into a Peter from time to time, denying the ones we claim to love the most. Jesus knew that sometimes we are called to even break bread with the betrayer, to dine with the enemy, and that doesn't mean that they will be the enemy forever. Maybe in whatever season they are in, they do not have the capacity to walk with you through the fire. They are people who aren't prepared to carry the full weight of this thing with you. They'd rather stand in their own self-righteousness at the moment, judging from the sidelines with discontent, than step into the waters with you. Jesus understood the human condition. But Jesus did not cast Judas out. He did not turn Peter away. Perhaps Jesus understood his assignment. I have come that you might have life, and that you might have it more abundantly. Even if we disagree, even if you stab me in the back, even if you work against my mission of liberation, I have come that you might have life. Jesus understood the assignment. I was thinking about Jesus' assignment, and I was thinking that Jesus was not the first one in the biblical canon who came to preserve life. I was reflecting on the story of Joseph that we went over a few weeks ago. In the 45th chapter, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers who sold him into slavery. Some of them wanted to kill him. They had betrayed him, and many years later, after he got to a certain position, they actually needed him, but they didn't even know he was who he was until he revealed himself. And in the revealing of himself, they started to become distressed. They started to worry if he would have grace for them. And Joseph says to them, "Come closer to me." And they came closer, and Joseph said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt, whom you stabbed in the back, whom you talked about. But do not be angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve your life. I remember what you did back when we were with our father Jacob, and I remember how you talked about me and how you dropped me in the pit and left me for dead, but God sent me before you to preserve life." Jesus was sent before this table of misfits, some of whom were knuckleheads he had to tell the same thing over and over again to, some of whom would sell him out into the hands of the people who would kill him, some of whom would deny him when the road got stony and the chastening rod reappeared. Jesus understood that, but he understood that the table was a table of grace, and he had been sent before them to preserve life. Beloved, sometimes communing with God means communing with the betrayer. I know you will betray me, and I know I might betray you. Jesus says, I know you will fall short because that is human condition. I know you will make mistakes, and some of them might even be deadly, but I am going to break bread with you anyway. I'm going to share this cup of the new covenant with you anyway because I have been sent before you to preserve life. I've come that you might have life. Amen. You can even walk away from me. Curse me on the way out the door. Curse this institution. Curse religion. But should you choose to come back in search of community, should you choose to come back in search of family, in search of care, in search of some kind of tomorrow, I'll be here waiting at the table for you, ready to pour you a drink and ready to give you a piece of bread because I have been sent before you to preserve your life. Friends, the table over there is a reminder. It is a reminder that though we fall away sometimes, God's love for us is so deep. God's desire to preserve our life is so strong. The table reminds us of the deep, deep love of Jesus. That even when we fall away, even when we are unsure about how to move forward, when we break bread, when we drink wine, we lean into the deep, deep love that surpasses all of our understanding and imagination because the assignment was to preserve life. Amen. And so we step into this moment on World Communion Sunday, knowing that we are called and loved by God and that God has committed God's self to preserving our life through Jesus' deep, deep love for us, and yet we are called to do the same for others. To be Jesus, to be Joseph, to understand that we might not all agree and we might not all see eye to eye, and sometimes people will do the most harmful and hurtful and egregious things, and yet there is a table of grace that we gather around and we center our hope on. Why do we gather? Why do we do the ritual? Because we need to remember the story of God's love, of God's peace, of God's hope in this world. The song says, "Oh, the deep, deep love of Jesus." It's often sung during Holy Week, but I find it appropriate here because Jesus' love is so deep in this passage. It is vast, it is unmeasured, it is boundless, it is free, rolling as a mighty ocean. He knew his time was near, and he wasn't going to waste it picking fights. He would tell them about themselves. Yes, he told them about themselves. But he wasn't going to waste it going back and forth, trying to convince them that persecution wasn't in fact coming. He knew it, and he wanted them to be ready. Because while they were the betrayers and the deniers in this scene, down the line, people would betray and deny them. He said, get ready. This is a part of the human condition, the human journey. But there is a love that is deep and vast. And I don't want you to lose sight of your assignment. Stay the course. Lean into the depth of Jesus' love. Will you sing with us? Oh, the